What if Stonehenge was actually a tool to train our minds? In today's episode, I wanted to talk to you about the discovery of one of the greatest memory techniques that our ancestors used to learn things ridiculously fast. Welcome to Mind Mysteries. And welcome back, my friends. Alright, so today I wanted to talk about one of the most famous historical monuments on Earth, Stonehenge. You know, before the English arrived, before the Romans, even before written language, Stonehenge has always been there, full of mysteries, full of secrets. And so many people have questioned, why was it created? There are stories of grand ceremonies, extraterrestrial beings from other planets. But what if Stonehenge served a bigger purpose? What if Stonehenge was actually built out of necessity? And what if Stonehenge was actually a tool to train our minds? Today, I want to talk to you about one of the greatest ways to improve your memory. And I want to talk about how our ancestors did it. But first, let's go back in history. You see, for most of human history, there was no writing, there was no paper. You couldn't just grab your phone or your computer to store information. There wasn't even paper. The Bible was actually the first book to have ever been printed in the world. And back in those days, the only way you could have recorded information is if you used this expensive material called papyrus, or other people use a stylus. It just used a wax tablet and you had to constantly erase things that you wrote. This is the stuff they used to make scrolls, which was very, very expensive. In other words, you couldn't record the stuff that you knew other than to memorize the information. And there's many mind-blowing stories about how ancient cultures were able to memorize a ridiculous amount of information. Therefore, storytellers, they were the keepers of knowledge in that era. Only through storytelling and music were we able to preserve knowledge. So what does this have to do with Stonehenge and improving our memory? Well, this all began with Lynn Kelly. She's an expert on mnemonic devices used by ancient cultures. In other words, she dedicated her life to learning how ancient cultures from around the world were able to store information. And she proposed a fascinating theory. She proposed that Stonehenge is actually a memory space. But what is a memory space? What does that mean exactly? A memory space is essentially a room or a building that you have memorized, and you use the pieces of furniture inside of the room to store information. You see, so you use those little things inside the room or the building as checkpoints, as reminders, as ways for you not to forget the information. So this is the simplest, most basic way that I could explain what a memory space is. Now, you can create the most sophisticated, the most over-the-top memory spaces that allow you to store thousands and thousands of pieces of information. This is turned into an art form. People do this even in tournaments and competitions. There is such a thing as memory champions. And it's really quite amazing all the things that your mind can memorize once you learn how these memory spaces work. It's kind of astonishing. And this technique is not new. It goes back hundreds and even thousands of years ago. If you've ever heard the phrase when someone is giving a speech, in the first place, this and that, in the second place, this or that. If you've heard of that, it's because the Greeks coined it that when they were talking about memory spaces. The first book about memory that was ever written in the world, it talked about how one of the greatest ways to memorize a lot of information, one of the greatest ways to do that is by using landscapes, using places, the world around you. And until this day, it's still one of the best ways to improve your memory. Now, this still doesn't explain why do we think that Stonehenge is actually one of these memory spaces. So let me give you a few reasons why I really believe that Stonehenge is actually a memory space. Reason number one, Stonehenge was built in a very important time in history. Stonehenge was built right in the middle of the time when humans were transitioning from a hunter-gatherer society to a sedentary society. Let me repeat that again. Stonehenge was built at the exact moment when humans were moving from being a hunter-gatherer society to a sedentary society. And what do sedentary societies need? Sedentary societies need a vast knowledge system to survive, both physically and culturally. It is completely impossible for a society to transition to that without having some type of system to record lots and lots of information. This is why I believe that Stonehenge was actually built out of necessity, because during that particular time in history, Stonehenge was becoming a hub of trading and commerce. Now, let's talk about the stones. If you wanted to create a great memory space, you're going to need a lot of variety. You're going to need a lot of different things so that you can store the information. So it is now believed that the Welsh blue stones, you know, all those little different stones that Stonehenge has, it is believed that they were moved there because of the great variety in their textures and in their colors. Those stones with those textures, it makes them so visually variable that it's almost like impossible not to see it as a memory space. Still not convinced? Did you know that just 20 miles away from Stonehenge, there actually exists a place called Avebury? A lot of memory experts and archaeologists are claiming now this was probably the world's first memory space home. There's actually a home, and around the home there's actually the same Welsh stones circles that you see in Stonehenge circling all around the house. Now there's such great and incredible variety on so many stones that if you know how memory spaces work, then you know this is the perfect way to memorize an incredible amount of information. If you look up Avebury and you see the way that it's constructed, all the memory experts say this is a haven to encode a lot of information into those stones because they can use them as files. This is space number 1, I can store this information. This is stone number 2, I can store that information. And you could walk around it and just store an incredible amount of information. Still not convinced? There's another stone circle near Stonehenge called Staton Drew. And this place is absolutely incredible. It's actually one of the largest and most complex stone monuments ever created. There's so many stones, so many sequences with different types of carving embedded in them that now memory experts and now some archaeologists like Lynn Kelly can't help but to see it as a way to encode the information. So if you are familiar with how memory spaces work, it's almost impossible not to see it as a memory space. And it will make sense based on how these cultures were transitioning from a hunter-gatherer society to a sedentary society. You needed some type of system to encode all of this information. And for these reasons and many more, I believe that Stonehenge is in fact a memory space. You know, people used to think that it was just a cemetery, but the amount of work that went into building Stonehenge for 1,500 years, it just does not justify it being a cemetery. You don't move all those rocks, you don't have all those varieties and colors and textures for the sake of it, especially because there's barely any bodies down below. And there you have it. Thankfully, we still have Aboriginal cultures alive today, and they share with us in Australia, as an example, how they also use memory spaces similar to Stonehenge to memorize a lot of information. There's actually a museum about this. It's called the Seven Sisters. It's in Australia, and they have an entire museum dedicated to showing you how these cultures were able to memorize so much information just because they understood this technique of memory spaces. Alright, so that's all I have for you today. If you love this video and you want to learn about more secret ancient techniques and how they were able to train their minds, be sure to subscribe. And if you want to learn more about how to improve your memory, I actually created a 30-day program where I break down in a simple and fun way all the greatest memory techniques from different time periods. I basically handpicked the best memory techniques from the Middle Ages, from the Roman era, from the Aboriginals, and I put it all together into this beautiful, simple, and fun memory program called Memory Mysteries, and you can learn all about that in the link below. Alrighty, so that's it for me today. I'll catch you on the next episode.